Hi, friends. Logan Clements here with the Better Events podcast. And this week's episode is a part 2 to our episode that we dropped last week, all about timing tips to help you create better events. This is a part 2, so you might want to go back and listen to part 1 before you continue with this episode. But like many of our episodes, it's pretty evergreen, so you can always listen to part 2 and then backtrack to part 1. And this one, we're really going to be talking about food timing, your programming timing, fundraising, transitions, loadout, and much, much more. If you're like Mary and I, we are always looking to perfect that crucial element of our events, time. And we think this episode is filled with some great tips for you that you can apply to your next event. So without further ado, let's get into the episode.
Welcome to the Better Events Podcast. Join two event strategists, Logan Clements and Mary Davidson, who believe we can all create, host, and attend better events. In this podcast, you will learn about event strategy and actions that you can use today as an event host, planner, or manager. Hear directly from the people who are creating innovative and inspiring events today and tomorrow, and grow your business along the way. Now, let's get started, and thanks for listening to the Better Events Podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to part 2 of our episode for continuation from last week. We are talking about timing tips to create a better event. And we are going to continue on with our conversation today. So if you haven't listened to part 1 of this, check out last week's episode and then come back and listen to this one. Or you could just listen to this. It's still going to be nice and relevant. We're just kind of jumping in further on in the event process. Before we get into it, we are going to have our conversation starter, of course. And today's conversation starter is presented by our friends at Tourism Richmond. And it's a great, fun question. So, Logan, if you had a superpower to help you with event planning, what would it be and how would you use it?
This is a great question, Tourism Richmond. I see this is like we're talking about timing. And so part of me goes, would my superpower want to be that I could stop time?
Ooh, that's good.
I know, but I also worry, it's a sidebar. I also joke I wish I could clone myself, but then I don't think I should clone myself because I think I'd be a jerk to my clone because I'd make my clone work really long hours and do a lot of things. And I worry that I would abuse this power, this like stopping time. I think it would be good and helpful. And by abusing, I think I would just try to get more done, which is not necessarily what I want. But I think it would be really helpful if I could stop time. And if I could give a second answer, it would be that I can apparate like Harry Potter and I can just snap my fingers and I'm there for wherever I want to be, because so that I don't waste as much time in the transit travel time for getting places.
I love all of those so deeply. I wish they were real. Mine would be that I could have stretchy arms so that I can not have to walk so much and just go grab things with my stretchy arms from one spot.
I'm just picturing you're what is it on The Incredibles, right? The mom has the super stretchy. I mean, that would be really helpful. And for load-in, you could carry all the things.
Yeah, because you would be really strong, stretchy arms. Yes. Yes.
That's so funny. I mean, thank you to our friends at Tourism Richmond for that question. I feel like that was a fun one. Again, if you haven't heard their episode that we did with their CEO, it's for Richmond, BC, up in Canada. And Mary and I also just had such a great time. And if you haven't watched our reel yet on Instagram, we ate a lot of good food and we made a lot of high fives, honestly, with all our new friends that we made up there. But before we jump into more of this talk about timing, we do want to plug our Better Events community over on Substack. It is a paid community. You can be a free subscriber, which will get you access to our monthly newsletter. But those that are paid get access to a bunch of awesome bonus content with new monthly episodes exclusively for that community. They got to hear from our moms. We also went into an event proposal power hour where Mary and I actually screen shared real event proposals we've done that you get to see and look at. And digest. We also talked about our origin stories kind of in the superpower world of how we got started in events. And then you also get access to quarterly meetups that are live with our whole group and our Discord community, which has just become such a fun resource for best practices and swapping stories. So hope to have you join us there. And Mary, you mentioned this. This is a part 2. Event timing is huge. And I think this was kind of funny. We thought we could fit it all into one episode last week, but it was so big. So we needed a part 2. as Mary mentioned, you can go back and listen to that first part. That's where we, episode 170, we discussed timing for like your total event time, your load in, your setup, your registration, and your on-site staff. And now we're going to get back into some different timing elements, but just again, sharing our best practices and lessons learned that'll help you in your planning process. So Mary, I'm going to kick this first one over to you because I feel like you've had more experience in overall event management for this, but let's talk about food timing. What are some best practices when it's come to food at your events?
Okay, so I'm not a caterer, but I know that we will utilize the catering timing that they prefer and give them suggestions as well as we're doing an event. And so I would say there's so many different directions you can go with this depending on how you're doing food. But typically catering is a little early. Like I've noticed that like if they're good, they try to get stuff out a little bit earlier. And then maybe if it's a buffet, they're not like opening the buffet until the designated time, but they're like ready. And I love that so much. Or if it's like a plated meal, sometimes to help with the timing, you can have like the salads pre-placed on the table. That's a really quick way to have better, quicker service at a plated seated dinner. And so like that's something that cuts back on timing. Now the issues come in when there's not enough banquet staff, because then if you're serving in that plated seated dinner style, then if they can't get entrees out fast enough, that's where you start kind of having an issue with the timing of things. And this happens pretty often, honestly. And some of that has to do with how many dietary restrictions there are and just things like that. And so this is a tricky thing to balance. And I would always lean on the catering team kind of to provide their advice and their expertise on that. So that's one thing to be aware of when you're doing food timing. And also to consider something that I've seen actually pretty often is that they'll clear food faster than I had anticipated in a way that I think it should be staying out. So if it's a buffet, they'll clear it faster than we told attendees it would be over. So many times we've had to stop them. If you're a caterer, send us an email. I don't understand why this happens. I don't get it, what the reason is. But sometimes I'm like, no, we definitely wanted that out for an hour. So can you please? But maybe it is like I don't know, food handling thing, something like that. So anyway, you could probably talk about timing and catering a lot, but those are the top things on my mind right now that have to do with food timing. Logan, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think from a programmatic piece, a part that we do is often putting food plates down and clearing the way usually makes a lot of noise. And so that is something that we will usually, when I do like award shows or big dinners, we will actually have like a dinner break from like a break on the stage so that folks can also eat, but also it helps with the sound. And again, we work with usually the catering team just to understand exactly how much time, usually 30 minutes. If it's over 1,000 people, we've had to do 45 minutes just to have some safety buffer there to plate, folks eat, and for them to then clear those plates away. So that's just something to think about considering. You can definitely talk over plates being cleared, but it is pretty noticeable with just because that it just takes some time. And then mine would call out for staff food timing. As a production staff, sometimes we get a little forgotten in the whole process. Attendees usually come first, which is great, and they should, but making sure it's a good rule of thumb for meals for any crew, especially if you're dealing with unions who have very strict meal timings. Where you quickly get into what's called a meal penalty, where you get it'll trigger overtime with your staff if your meal is not ready in time. So always have it be set and ready 15 minutes before the crew is scheduled to take their meal. I've had a couple of shows where they haven't had the food ready, and it really is everything's planned to the minute that even you waiting 10 minutes, now your break's only 20. And if you're union, that doesn't count. You then have to give them those 10 extra minutes. And that, again, meal penalty overtime, it's a big trickle down effect. So if lunch is at noon for your crew, you want the food and your catering team to have it set by 11:45. So that's just really important to think through some of that timing. And then just as an anecdote, as a attendee to events, I love a late night snack. If you are having me attend your evening event, I see it again in weddings, it's really common, or any social event, but even I would say conferences that have an after party, having some food element as a part of that. To me, that's the more memorable piece, not the event chicken that I had at dinner, because you have so many things you're asking my attention. I'm paying attention to maybe the stage and the programming is going to be what sticks. But just thinking about doing a late night snack, especially if you're serving alcohol, it's just really nice to have something in people's stomachs before they head out. So just something else to think about, adding some food budget to the evening.
One thing to add, one more thing about timing, you kind of were starting to allude to this, but what I've seen very often too is a holding service time from a catering team. So this is really common during fundraising events, which we might touch on in a little bit. But like if it's a really impactful moment, whether it's a fundraising event or not, just not having the banquet team doing anything. They're not refilling drinks. They're not picking up anything. Like it is just pure silence. And so I wanted to call that out as well, because that's sometimes a really, really important part where many times we've had to grab the staff and be like, no, remember, you're not supposed to be doing anything at this time. So wanted to call that out as well. And then that brings us to our next portion of timing, which is stage timing. This is the dinner. If it's like a day-long program, multi-day programming. Logan, can you kick us off with some tips for this?
Yes. I mean, we've done, I feel like, episodes on this that just dive in even more, but really making sure that you're timing out, and this is where your run a show can be really helpful, like exactly how long some of these sessions are supposed to take. If it's just a dinner of a one-off, it's just making sure, like we already talked about food. Are you taking a break? Are you not taking a break? How long do you want folks sitting there and listening to your stage programming, or do you have something after that? So making sure you're saving enough time in each of these buckets. One client I had that adjusted some of their event timing from one year to the next was because they got feedback from attendees that it was a fundraising dinner, but the attendees felt they didn't actually get time to talk to the people at their table. Because the way we timed it is that they come, they're in a kind of a cocktail reception, then they sit down, and then we're talking at them for the next 2 hours, and then the event's done. And you pretty quickly, you've eaten and done all your stuff while the programming's happening, and then you get up and you're done. And that was something they adjusted, and they added in that dinner break was like a programmatic piece because attendees wanted to get to talk to each other. Another thing to think about with like stage timing, day-long programming, this is your balance between maybe keynotes and breakouts, and just understanding this is where I think it's so important. And we're going to have an episode on this about why event planners should always go and be attendees at other people's events, because I think there's a bad precedence in the industry that we're all trying to do more in a day with attendees, and it's exhausting. So really thinking through, like, how long does this keynote really need to be? How many rounds of these breakouts? I'm seeing it a lot for my corporate events where they're just trying to maximize. I had one program that was a 3-day program, got shoved into a 2.5-day program. And it was really long for attendees, which then made it a really long crew day. So that's just something to think about, especially if you're trying to optimize budget. A good idea, a good rule of thumb would be to do keynotes all at one part of the day, whether it's front loaded in the morning or back loaded in the afternoon, evening, so that you can cut that crew and save that money while the team's in breakouts. I've also had some clients who insist on doing morning keynotes and then an evening keynote. And you have to pay the whole crew to be there that whole time, even while there's sessions not happening in their room for a large number of hours. So that's just something to think about. I feel like when it comes to your stages and your timings, it's always cheaper to have less things happening at one time, just from a budget perspective. But it's also, if maybe you're trying to save money on hotel nights for your attendees, then, that's where having multiple tracks and multiple things happening at once maybe makes sense. Mary, how about you? What are some stage timing tips that you've got?
Honestly, I think you covered most of the ones that would be on top of my mind. So perhaps we can transition to fundraising element timing, which I have definitely some tips on. This could also be its own topic, probably. It's just like a huge thing. We say an event is an event, and there are lots of things that are the same. But with fundraising events, there are some elements that are a little specific, and they really have to do with timing. Some are more traditional than others. But for example, when you are having folks at a cocktail hour or something like that, which is very common, there are lots of fundraising elements that are happening during that time, different revenue enhancers like raffles, silent auction, things like that. So if you're doing a silent auction, this is where timing really comes into play, because you will typically close the silent auction at a certain time, or maybe you have so many items that you have multiple silent auctions and you're closing them all at different times. And so that's a timing thing. And so once you close them, you or volunteers have to be ready to like pull the bid sheets if you're still doing like traditional paper bid sheets, and pull those so nobody can bid anymore. You keep it fair, right? So that's a very specific timing piece in your timeline to make sure people are locked and loaded and ready just to take those papers. You have very specific timing, and this goes into programming more about like when you're pulling the raffle, what time you're communicating to attendees that it's being pulled. Typically, when you do a raffle, you have to tell them like when it's going to be pulled. It's like part of the purchase process and rules. And so that's another timing thing. And beyond that, when you get to the bulk of the program, I think kind of some timing that we've already discussed will come into play, but I wanted to call out those specific fundraising elements that really impact the timing as well. Logan, I know you do fundraising stuff as well, so do you have anything to add?
I think just whenever you have a live auction, make sure you work with get some feedback on timing from your auctioneer, especially if you're not working with someone who's just in event production. You know, that was something that I think my first time doing a live auction, we were wildly off on our run of show with timings. And a lot of it was I just hadn't done one of those before. And then I didn't coordinate with the auctioneer. We tried to get a hold of them to get some feedback early on, and they weren't able to get back to us about it. And so it was just a little frustrating in the event itself because it threw off my timing. We had, of course, it's the event where I had a fashion show as an element as a part of this event. And it really just ran into everything with timing. And so again, the more that you work with some people the same, over and over again, or you do it yourself, you're going to get a better feel for how long that stuff takes, but just making sure you're not budgeting too much time or even too little time. And I think that's where I ended up falling was I budgeted a little too little time. It was a very wordy auctioneer, not in a bad way, but just, again, my estimates were off. So, and then we're going to go into transitions and the timing for that. I think this is one I will touch on walk-ons, walk-offs, and then Mary, I'll have you dive in on breaks and any other transitions we're thinking about. But this is something like in your run a show, your timeline, whatever document, you need to make sure you're accounting for transition. So on the very small scale, when I say walk on, walk off, like speaker coming on, next speaker coming off, this is important to factor into your overall programming, especially if you have a lot of transitions, meaning a lot of different speakers coming up there. Maybe it's a fundraising luncheon and you have 10 different speakers. You're going to have 15, 30 seconds here or there for each speaker to come on and come off and that transition time. And if you don't allocate for that, that's where you can accidentally run really far behind without meaning to. And so I want to make sure that you think through that. Also, if you have any furniture that has to move, like if you have a panel discussion into a keynote of a single like TED Talk style speaker, you want to move the furniture, like that'll take some time, and you can play a video or something to give you cover, but that will take some times out of your elements. Because the big thing, and I should have mentioned it back when I talked about stage timing, but I always say like my run a show shouldn't be aspirational. It shouldn't be the time I wished my event would be. It needs to be as close to accurate as possible. So it really needs to know like, hey, if that speaker normally if I tell them 10 minutes and they're going to talk for 15, I would rather have 15 minutes in my internal run a show. And we still communicate to the speaker, you have 10 minutes, you have 10 minutes, you have 10 minutes, but we know we're a little bit closer to what it actually will be. And then another stage transition, I guess, would be also if you have an award show, making sure you're allocating enough time for like the winner when you announce them, that they have time to come to stage, because sometimes they know they're winning. They're going to be seated really close to the front of the room. Sometimes it's a surprise and they could be seated from anywhere in the room. And that's something that we started. I do an awards program every year that we've really honed in on that timing. And it really is, you only need about a minute to 90 seconds for both the winner to come to stage. If they're going to say a few things into the microphone, take their picture and be done. It goes quick, but you still need to allocate that time. Mary, what about breaks or other transitions timing?
Yeah, breaks are great. This is something that Logan and I have been talking about because, as you all know, we're planning the Better Events Conference for this year, 2024. And similar to last year, we always had, a good discussion about breaks and how often. And so if you have like a 2-hour program, you may not be having a break. You might. It depends what it is. But for something that's like a day long, multiple days, then yeah, you are probably going to have a break. And so thinking about how long that needs to be, but it's so hard to have people go away and then get them back. And so really considering enough time just on people moving and things like that. And you often need, multiple voice of gods or announcements for getting people to sit down again or like get back where they need to be. And so that's all something to consider when you're discussing the timing of a break. So if you want a 5-minute break, cool. But in reality, it's probably going to be 10 minutes because it's going to take people a long time to get back.
And my hot take, Mary, is I have never seen a 10-minute break be 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Unless it is a true small event, or like you and I meeting being like, hey, let's take 5, and we'll take 5. But like if you have any size of a group, it needs to be at least 15 minutes, if not 30. And this is where like working events in Vegas, where these venues are ginormous and it takes so long to walk, or even if you're thinking, oh, the person might walk back to their hotel room. some of these venues, they can't do that even in 15 minutes. Like this is again where I think there's some pressure from some stakeholders at events that they want us to be as efficient as possible. And so that means short breaks, lots of sessions, get them in, get them out kind of thing, that I just always want to push back and say, like, a 30-minute break, it feels hefty when we think about it, like, wow, 30 minutes. But yes, if your session runs a few minutes over, I'm going to go to the bathroom, I need to get my coffee, I'm going to come back in. Like, give yourself the gift of more time, because I feel like that is just something that, again, I don't think it's planners doing it, but I think maybe they just need to fight for those breaks more. And maybe you split the difference, do 20-minute breaks. But I just think a 10-minute break, almost any session always goes a few minutes over. Like you said, it takes so long getting people in and out. They get stuck in the hallway. You just need to make sure you're allocating as enough time as possible. And I think another thing, thinking about transitions, this kind of ties into food, Mary, I'd love your take, is, again, I've experienced this from the production perspective, but if you ever have like a cocktail reception going into a dinner or some kind of program, you need to close the bars at least 30 minutes before you want people in their seats. I don't know if you do it 15 minutes prior. Again, it's like herding cats, trying to get people from one space to another. And closing bars is the quickest way to get people out of a space, especially if you're already serving beer and wine, maybe at their table. But that's one I experienced it where we had to hold our programming in our room because we were waiting for people to get out of the lobby area, the reception area, and get into the ballroom. And it was just, again, the easiest solution was closing the bars. It was a different person's scope of work, so it was hard. We'd mentioned it, we called it out, and it just didn't happen. But whatever planners I can reach to say, save more time between closing the bar and when you need people in the next room.
All right. I don't have anything to add to that. Covered it pretty well. And so let's jump into after parties, which is another part of the event not to be forgotten. And my immediate reaction to this for timing is that after parties, I feel like always go longer than I want them to. But also, I'm the planner, so maybe an attendee would feel differently. But like, we've had after parties that start at 10:30 and don't end until 1 a.m. And it's just like from 12 to 1, it's just like 5 people breaking it up on the dance floor. And I'm like, we could have ended an hour ago. Like, most people are gone. So after party timing is important, really figuring out how long it's going to be, how long people are going to stay, and all of those mini components. But this ties directly into, again, when do you have to be out of the venue? Because that's just another component. And you can start breaking down other parts of the event while the after party is going. So that's like a plus. But what time do you need to be out of that specific space that the after party is taking place? Generally, timing wise, I really dislike after parties. I think when it's like almost too much of a good thing sometimes. That's just my personal opinion, probably because I'm tired and ready to go home, and I'm manifesting that here. Logan, what's your opinion on timing and after parties?
Yeah, I mean, I think a nice workaround for that, Mary, is, you do an offsite or another location for the after party, or even I've seen it like you have a different planner who's doing after party. And so that helps take some of the load off while you're still in the event. Someone's already doing after party setup. From again, my perspective as a producer, I think the big thing to think about too with timing is, what time do you want the after party to start? And then how early can it start? And to Mary's point, how late could it start? Because again, you're like, oh, I paid for 2 hours of bar. I don't want people coming after 9:15 because we got to get them out of here by 11. And I don't want to, pay for a bunch of time we're not using. I say that specifically, again, from an event that I've done, that our program, our awards dinner part, can go pretty quick. And we've had to use our host to help coach them to land the plane to end the program as close to 9 o'clock as possible. And one year we were trending super quick. I don't know what was in it, but everybody wanted to get to the after party, I guess. They're like short remarks, everything. And we were almost tracking to end at 8:30. And I was getting messages from the after party planner being like, I'm not going to be ready. We are not ready at 8:30. It has to be 8:45. So then the following year, it was like, all right, let's talk about that window as early as 8:45, as late as 9:15. But we were all trying to track to end at 9 because it was about 3 rooms doing that at once. So I think thinking through that as well can help you understand kind of either how much stress and importance you need to put on your program for ending on time so you get to the after party on time, or if it doesn't matter, just knowing that information will be really helpful. As we said, best made plans are always changed in the moment, but these are just some, best practices of things to think through. Now we've gotten to the after party, Mary. We've wrapped it up. It's time for breakdown and loadout. What are some timing tips you have around those things?
I mean, this is my favorite part of the event, breakdown and loadout. breakdown always goes way faster than I kind of anticipate it to. And I would say generally, yeah, that's true. I was going to say maybe some caveats, but it's pretty quick sometimes the breakdown and load out, which I love to see. I think we all love to see it. So, anyway, with that in mind, it still does take time. So that's where you're considering how long that takes and all that good stuff. But really not forgetting how many people you need to make that successful. It's not just the vendors. That's a huge part of it. But it's like volunteers. Like, what are the other components of your event that you're going to have to get out of there? Because you have to get everything out. And so what does that look like? And who do you need to be successful and get that done on time? There have been too many fundraising events for me where we're relying on volunteers where we've really gotten close to that time. And that's the big deal. There was one event specifically, it was kind of like a concert and people were having a great time. I was having a great time. And the person who was in charge of vendor management was like texting me because I was at the front of the room, and she was like, we have to close this down right now. The vendors are like going to start breaking down. We're not going to be able to get out in time. We have to be out by midnight, blah, blah, blah. And I'm trying to get in touch with the client who's having a great time listening to this concert. And I'm like, you need to make a call, because if we don't stop this right now, we're going to be late and we're going to be charged like $5,000. Like, it's not a small thing. And so long story short, we were 30 minutes late, and the venue just ended up saying like, it's fine, but they were super nice to us in that scenario. So it's important. Everything impacts your breakdown and your loadout. Try to be successful by having enough people to support you in that. And those are my tips for that. Logan, what would you add?
Yeah, and I think factoring that time into your quote or your project rate or whatever that is, and understanding what parts of breakdown and loadout you're in charge of. I know there's some planners that don't like schlepping things, and their part is like once, I mean, I think more in the wedding category, there's some coordinators that are like, I'm there to coordinate. Once I'm done coordinating, I get out of there. I'm not breaking down any equipment. And there's others that are like, I will pack up all your decorations. I will take them to your house. I will do this thing. All of a sudden it's 2 a.m. Like all of this stuff, it, like you said, it goes faster than setup, but it still takes time. And some of my bigger projects take another day to load out. They don't load out same day. And so then there's certain crew that you can say, okay, goodbye, you're done after today. You don't need to help with loadout. And then I know some that bring in more like kind of like crew hands to help with breakdown versus keeping like on the operators for, more money. But just making sure you're factoring this in financially and with your energy. As Mary mentioned, once you're ready to go, like you're just ready to go. So I always like to break down and like kind of, my pet peeve is people breaking down while the event's still happening. So I say that, but I also do know there's certain like not as obvious elements that you can start packing up and getting ready so that when you're done, you're just really packing up the elements that everybody can see. Like, for example, registration. I always, when I'm running registration, like throughout the day, we are putting away, we're breaking down stations and just making like consolidating. So we're down to like 2 people checking people in by the end of the day. And we've packed up the stuff we don't need. We've labeled boxes. That's another thing, is really just making sure you have good, it's not even timing, this is like organizational, but make sure you like label what boxes are. I take photos of my boxes for one client that always sends stuff to a storage unit so I can try to remember what we packed up where. I think certain elements that you have that are so important, like if it's anything financial for fundraising or, wedding gifts, like some of that stuff that can easily get misplaced, like being really specific on who's taking that, where did they take it, that handover happened, that checkbook got back to that person, or that cash box, or whatever it is just important, because sometimes breakdown and loadout of all the parts of the process can feel the most like crazy, I feel like, or like disorganized, because it's just like, get out of here. We're pulling cables, we're unplugging stuff, we're getting out. So make sure, you think about all of that with timing, but usually you can take 8 hours to load in and only 2 hours to load out. That's totally works. But back to our part 1, where I think we mentioned check with your vendors to make sure all that timing works. Because I'm sure, Mary, I think you've alluded to too, that I've had a rogue vendor or two that like wants to start breaking down in front of everyone. And it's been a fight sometimes to say, no, you need to wait till the event ends. And they're incentivized because it's an hourly person. They just want to get out of there. And you're incentivized because you're the organizer. And it doesn't look good to see someone like breaking down a backdrop while people are actively still, in the space. So, Mary, any other timing tips that you like to use with your events?
I'm sure there are, but I think we covered so many in these last 2 episodes. So I'll probably just leave it at that. Any final words from you, Logan?
I think hopefully just they know that timing's important. Like we
It's
said, it's the gift of
important.
time.
Yeah.
And just like any of this stuff, like the talking through so many of our backup plans and things is like the more you can have these conversations ahead of time, because you'll find that time can feel very fleeting in the setup
Mhm.
moments. Like
Yeah.
you'll look down and be like, where did 45 minutes go? So just the more that you can allocate for this, I'm a big fan of buffer, especially if it's a first-time client, first-time team, first-time venue. I know venue sometimes can be a big point of access. I mean, I've even had it where it's been like, you get access to the space at 8 a.m. and we get there and the doors are locked. And it's like, okay, we got to call somebody and figure it out. Like, every planner has their story of why then they're like, all right, now it's 7:30 or, whatever it is to allocate some of that time. So yeah, don't be afraid to gift yourself with some extra time. Make sure you're tracking these things, take good notes, give yourself next year you a better idea of exactly how long things take. So again, we're probably going to be able to do a part 3 on this too. There's so much timing. Let us know if we missed something. Mary, though, before we wrap up, you have our bonus tip this week.
All right. Yes. Our bonus tip for today is to do one-on-ones with your team members. If you lead a team and have kind of consistent meetings with them, this seems obvious. It's something that I used to do. We kind of fell off the bandwagon and stopped doing it for a few reasons. And then I was talking to my mentor and she was like, well, do you do one-on-ones with your team? And I was like, well, isn't that a wild idea? I should start doing that again. And it seems so obvious in the moment, but it's something that I think is important just to give one-on-one time to everyone. And you can connect in that way and talk way more specifically about things that are going on. And so if you have a team, this is your friendly reminder to do weekly one-on-ones with them. They can be short, but it's just a good opportunity to check in individually with each person. So that is the bonus tip for today.
Thank you, Mary. So helpful. And I think, if there's some managers listening to this and they go, I don't do one-on-ones, you should. That sounds like you said, obvious, but so crucial and an easy thing we could probably stop doing when we get busy. So thank you for that. That brings us to the end of this week's episode. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Better Events Pod. You can join our paid private community over on Substack. You can also send us an email at bettereventspod@gmail.com. We also love connecting with you directly on LinkedIn. If you want to send Mary and I a request, we love hearing from you. And as always, we thank you for listening to the Better Events Podcast, and we'll be back in your feeds again next Wednesday.